Wilson only took Democrats along when he went to Europe, and this was a mistake too. He should have taken a majority of Democrats, because after all he was from the Democratic Party, but he should have taken Republicans along to make it look like it was a bipartisan effort. Well, he had set the stage for a big shellacking. It has been said that Woodrow Wilson saw no gray. He only saw black and white. Every issue was either good or it was evil, and there was no in between. And a lot of issues in real life fall in a gray area, and this is what causes a lot of conflicts with a lot of us. But he didn't see any gray. He saw only black and white. Now, anyway, he was our president. The first 4 years of his office were spent doing reforms. Then the last 4 years he had to spend dealing with the European situation. He also had to deal with the death of his wife. He was one of the few presidents whose wife died while he was in office. And he married again. Again, one of about 2 White House weddings we've had. But he married a woman while in the White House. And folk, this is something I've just become aware of, something I've never told another class before. But if you look up Edith Wilson, and again, maybe I shouldn't say this because I can't prove it, nobody has proven it, but there are persons who believe he really wanted his first wife dead so he was really free to marry Edith, and may have helped kill his first wife. This was rumored at the time. It's a rumor we don't talk about much anymore, and again, why mention it? I'm not sure I should have, but I did. Again, I want to tell you, it might not be true, but it shows something about what some people suspected of him at the time. Something I mean, you'll find this if you look up Edith Wilson on the internet, former First Lady. Anyway, Woodrow Wilson, yes?
Say that about Prince Charles.
They do. Now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, nobody might remember it, but they do say it about Prince Charles, yes. All right. Anyway, Woodrow Wilson went to Europe, and with all due respect, he tried. He tried hard to get Europeans to make a more lenient treaty toward Germany. He couldn't. But anyway, he had an idea of a League of Nations. The League of Nations would be where nations could get together in a room and talk over their differences, and with the help of other nations, iron out their problems without going to war. It eventually became the United Nations. But his idea was a League of Nations. Also, there was a treaty negotiated in Geneva, Switzerland, a neutral country, called the Geneva Convention. All right, so basically Wilson came home with 3 main treaties. There were several treaties, but I'm going to talk about 3 of them. The League of Nations, the Geneva Convention, and the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the United States Constitution says that the President must get approval of 2/3 of the Senate before any treaty will be ratified or become law. President Wilson came home and found that his country, or the Senate, was unwilling to let the United States join the League. So the United States did not join. The United States never ratified the Geneva Convention, and never I'm not sure if we ratified the Treaty of Versailles or not, but we did not ratify the League, at least I know that for sure. President Wilson was extremely upset that his pet project, which he believed would prevent future wars, was not signed. Now, about the Geneva Convention, some of the things they did was to outlaw gas warfare. One of the things, so gas had been responsible for 1/3 of the battlefield deaths in World War I. And they felt like we ought to learn how to fight more humanely, so it outlawed gas warfare, and said that prisoners of war should be treated in a humane manner. And the only thing a prisoner had to give, the only information, was his name, rank, social security number, and date of birth. Again, we had to learn that was in the Army. 4 things: name, rank, social security number, date of birth. and had a few other rules in it that persons dropping from an airplane could not be shot at while they were coming down, supposedly in an attempt to make warfare more humane. The United States did not ratify. Even though the United States has tried to fight by the rules of the Geneva Convention from that time till this. Well, Woodrow Wilson went around the country trying to stir up votes to get the American people on his side. He could not. Now, folk, I always say this when I come to this part of the lecture, so I'm going to say to this class. It is known that in time of war, people become extremely religious. And I can personally verify that when our country was attacked on September 11th, 2001, the attack occurred on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, all the churches in town were packed out like it was Easter Sunday. Where are they now? But anyway, the church were packed. But when the commanding officer tells his troops, the enemy's been spotted and we're to engage as soon as we get word from higher headquarters, you won't find an atheist among that crowd. You'll find atheists among on college campuses, but persons who have been there say that everybody in that group gets religion in a hurry. Everybody starts rallying around the chaplain, who all of a sudden becomes the most important man in the outfit. I said this to one class once, and one lady came back to class and said, yeah, a woman who's about to have a baby is in the same way. You won't find an atheist among those women either. Be that as it may, people become extremely religious in wartime. And they become very interested in, among other things, Bible prophecy, and it looked like, now I'm not saying it was, but it looked like Bible prophecy was being fulfilled. End-time prophecy called for three things I want to point attention. Number one, a very super great war. Number two, a great plague. Your book doesn't even mention it, but the World War I was followed by the big influenza outbreak of 1918 that killed more persons than did bullets, at least more Americans than bullets. I had a great uncle who survived the war, and on his way home was hit by the plague of 1918 and died. The Great Plague of 1918 is a big mystery. We think it was the bird flu, and that's why we're so concerned. It might have been swine flu, but it was a big, it was this before we discovered viruses, so we're not sure what it was, but it was a big disease that just appeared, lasted a few months, killed millions of people, and then all of a sudden vanished. Yeah.
Then around that time, America was trying to get their plumbing together.
Get what?
Trying to get their plumbing together. The way they live, the garbage, the plumbing, the way because of urbanization, and they had all those people didn't know where to put their trash and all that stuff, so disease came from that. That could be a possibility.
It could. I've never heard that theory.
Oh, it's not a theory. It's just that I'm taking from what happened around that time, and then that's what
yeah, I don't know. I don't think we know what caused the plague, except it probably originated in Hong Kong, in China, like a lot of these do. Found its way across the Pacific, but again, I'm not certain of that. Again, the electron microscope had not yet been invented. The virus had not been discovered, and it was a mystery. But anyway, we had a war, big war, super big war, big plague, and then end-time prophecies call for a covenant. They call for a great big man coming on the scene. We know of him as Antichrist, and a covenant. And folks, the reason I bring this up, I think this had everything to do with why the American people would not ratify the treaty. They didn't want to be involved in a covenant. Now again, you can argue if you want to, and you're welcome to, but I think this, and this is something no ordinary history book is going to mention, but I think that deep down inside, this was what was going on in the minds of even the senators as they voted, and the American people as they rejected Wilson's ideas. They said, we don't want to join any more wars in Europe. We don't want to entangle ourselves in any kind of entangling of treaties.
Question.
Yes.
What was the religious climate in America at that time?
During the war, extremely strong convictions. Then when the war ended, they went back to very loose living. So the effect was not by any means permanent. I mean, once the war was over, Americans, women began to smoke, drink. They got the right to vote. They began to smoke, drink, and wear short skirts and become flappers, dance girls, and visit nightclubs and engage in all kinds of liberty. But during the war, this stuff did not go on. Well, yes and no, it did. I mean, the war, it affects people two ways. Some makes them more moral, and in some cases makes them more immoral.
But the masses are generally more religious.
But very much so, yes. And church attendance was up. There was an increased interest in Bible prophecy. Then the war ended and people returned to their old ways.
Now, are we working back from 1918 or we want?
No, I'm still in 1980, the peace treaty. I'm still there with the peace treaty. The peace treaty came about in 1919. Anyway, what happened to Mr. Wilson? In effect, he had a massive stroke while out campaigning. He was secretly rushed back to Washington and put in bed. And for 7 or 8 months, our country was without a president. And during those months, this was before the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment that was ratified in 1966 said that when the president cannot act, the vice president takes over. But there was no 25th Amendment. The vice president, in effect, said, hey, the president is not dead, so the vice president just refused to do anything more than what a vice president is supposed to do. So who ran the presidency? You've heard, his wife. We don't know how many bills she might have signed into law forging over her husband's signature, but she would not allow anyone to see the president. And during the time that Mr. Wilson was flat on his back, the country had a depression, a big, deep depression. There were riots. There was a big communist scare, a scare of a communist takeover called the Red Scare. All kinds of unrest and civil disturbance, and the president was completely out of it. Basically, our country had no president. This was one of the excuses we used to get the 25th Amendment up. And Mrs. Wilson apparently served as chief executive, but secretly. The one and only time in our country's history we've actually had something that closely resembled a female president. There is a story going around at one time when he got well enough, her husband, Woodrow Wilson, got well enough to hold a cabinet meeting. He held a cabinet meeting at one of the offices in the White House, but she was at the door listening. As soon as her husband started talking incoherently, she suddenly burst into the room, dragged her husband out of the room, and told the cabinet to all of you go home and hush your mouth about anything you saw in here, hush about anything that went on in here. This actually supposedly happened. I mean, if you can imagine her telling the Secretary of Defense to keep his mouth shut and the Secretary of State to keep his trap shut also. But this supposedly actually occurred. But again, it was all kept hush-hush and quiet. All right, so much for President Wilson. Your book goes on to talk about the peace treaties. Now, something that is not in a book, but I'm going to throw in. Kellogg-Briand Pact was passed at this time. It was designed to outlaw war. Very ambitious, but there was no way to enforce it. But they thought if we just get a bunch of nations to sign an agreement to outlaw war, and most of the nations signed, including Germany, they were more or less forced into it, that we'll never go to war again. Well, the immediate result of what happened right after World War I was there was a famine in Russia that killed millions of people, but also there was a Great Depression in the early 1920s. Now, I'm not talking about the one in the 30s. It's called the Forgotten Depression. It's the Forgotten Depression because we don't remember it anymore, but there was a big economic turndown brought on in part by famine, but in part by the fact that Germany was unable to meet its payment of its reparations. So finally we renegotiated with Germany to greatly reduce the reparations, and the economic downturn came to an end. Yes?
Germany couldn't pay for reparations?
They couldn't at first, but then we eased up on them a little bit. Now, I want to say this because this is going to become important later. I mean, a person wrote a book called The Forgotten Depression. And he said the reason the Depression lasted so short was that our American government stayed out of it. And the people involved at the time, they all just got to work and they solved the Depression by themselves without any kind of government interference. That's ironic because at the end of the 1920s, we were to have another Depression where the government did get involved. The Depression started in 1929 and it went on and on and on. 1930, 1931, 1932 was really bad. 1933, 1934, 1935, if you're getting tired, they got tired too. 1936 and 1937, it got worse again. It got really bad. 1938, then it really got dark in 1939, and it ended abruptly in 1940. Because in 1940, the United States decided it was going to help Britain and Russia fight World War II. So the government started ordering all these armaments, and everybody went back to work making armaments. And the Depression ended just overnight. People woke up one morning and were told, hey, this factory's looking for them. The factories actually started stealing each other's workers to try to get help because they knew the government was going to buy everything they made anyway. So the Depression ended, and you might say, well, if the Depression ended that easily, why didn't it end before? Personally, I think we had a president who did not want it to end. But I'll get around to him in a little bit. Anyway, the period between the wars. Your book calls them the hopeful years, the 1924 to 1929. They're called sometimes the Roaring 20s, and I've already mentioned how in America it was the age of the flapper, the dance girl with a cigarette in her lips and short hair and a mini skirt. The women had just been given the right to vote, and everybody thought this would be a big turn in American politics, and instead the women turned and became showgirls, dance girls. But there was a big revolution among women, and when we talk about what happened in Russia, it was about the same time. But the nations of the world gave the women the right to vote, and in the United States, women voted for president for the first time in 1920. In 1928, the country elected Herbert Hoover, and Herbert Hoover took office in April 1929, and he made a famous speech. He said, everybody in America, we're going to soon have 2 cars in every garage. There'll be 2 chickens in every pot. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We're about to see the day when poverty will be wiped out on the face of the American scene. And within 7 months, the whole thing came crashing down. And his speech is only remembered for being one of the most ironic inaugural addresses in all of history. What caused the Great Depression? Some books say we may never know, but here's the view that the history books that this school gives, and I'm not going to question it because a lot of it is true. Factories were not paying their workers or their shareholders. Basically what a factory would do, if the factory made a profit, it would say, hey, we're going to use these profits to expand our output and make more. So let's say it's an automobile factory. They make a profit selling their cars, so what they do is sell more cars. Well, today we realize what they should have done was increase the wages of their workers and increase the dividends they paid out to their shareholders and not produce more cars. Because inevitably they were going to build to where they could produce so much that they couldn't sell. And everything was going to go burst. There are other problems. The farmer. In the early 1920s, the farmers in the Western world learned that you can buy these tractors on credit. You can buy reapers and combines and balers and all this equipment on credit. Farmers thought, hey, this is great. Also, better fertilizers were invented. So they began to plant every acre they had. They took their produce to the market, and guess what happened to the price? Price went down. Well, the farmer then would just try to produce even more next year and find the price had gone down still. And some expert finally advised the farmers, you farmers, you ought to produce less and less and see if the price would go up. But the price just kept going down. So the farmers were not prospering. The factory workers were making very low wages. They weren't prospering either.